I also want to acknowledge that we stand today on Aboriginal land, that their sovereignty was never ceded, and with every Occupy meeting, thank you, with every Occupy Melbourne event, we started with acknowledging that there has been an occupation of this land that needs to be the first business that we deal with as Australians. For me, Occupy Melbourne has been a dive into a wild ocean. Sometimes I feel like I've been sucked out into a rip. Other times I've chosen to dive in. I certainly haven't been part of every wild storm or been the most rigorous swimmer, but somehow Occupy Melbourne keeps drawing me back. I was very intrigued when Occupy Melbourne was called. I was curious at what I knew, as Nick said, was a hastily drawn strategy led by none of the usual suspects. So what I saw on that first day, as the pictures showed before, deeply inspired me, because what I saw was people seeking to live the change that they wanted to be in the world. So Occupy Melbourne's taken many forms in the last 6 months. So there was one amazing week at City Square, followed by the brutal eviction that we saw. Then there was roving evictions in Melbourne public parks, often without any kind of ability to have tents at all, inspiring tenacity by many people who slept out in the rain under tarps. And also in a church. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of the forms that Occupy Melbourne has taken. And this year has seen the birth of Occupy Fridays, where the Occupy movement has returned back to City Square and uses Fridays to do all of what Occupy Melbourne seeks to do, to share food, to share goods, to vigorously debate ideas, and to seek to build community. I'm a little bit different to Nick in that I probably identify as a professional protester or maybe a rabid resistor or something, that I have been involved in lots of different movements around Melbourne for the last decade or so. And for me, Occupy Melbourne shares some similarities to lots of those experiences, but it is also distinctly different. Firstly, I think it is different because it's not focused on one issue. Unlike Egypt, we're not focused on one dictator to overthrow, which I think is both a strength and a weakness. But it is based on a passionate conviction that this whole system needs overthrowing. The conviction isn't unique. Many of us think the whole system needs overthrowing, but I think its expression is. Rather than protest and resist the system or to go and build an alternative, Occupy Melbourne seeks to do both together. So it seeks to publicly live the alternative while also forcefully articulating the case of why this is so. In many ways for me, Occupy Melbourne was a festival of ideas, and not just of ideas but of action. So we had anarchists and socialists, zeitgeisters, people who identified as apolitical or non-political, all working together on this broad agenda. And this has created many opportunities for people to learn from each other, both formally and informally. This diversity certainly has its tension. The debates about whether Occupy Melbourne should be a place of buying and selling was actually about a tussle of ideas, about some differences between different groups operating. When we had a passionate debate about whether we would march back to Treasury Gardens or walk to Treasury Gardens, it wasn't about semantics. It was about people passionately wanting to be involved in the sort of change they wanted to be involved in. So what I wanted to spend my minutes talking about is what I think Occupy Melbourne has achieved. And I think it has achieved many things. So perhaps I'm the Pollyanna to Nick's cynic this evening. So the first thing I think Occupy Melbourne has powerfully achieved is making the realisation and the statement that the process is the point. Occupy movements around the world have been drawn not just because of the concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, but the concentration of power in the hands of the few. And the Occupy movements all around the world, and Occupy Melbourne itself, was passionate to say we can create something different, and I think it has. We have had hours and hours of debates about how our General Assembly should run, which are our consensus-based decision-making forums. And this shows to me that people are deeply passionate to make sure that we don't replicate the power dynamics that sit in the rest of our society. I'm really aware that I'm the one of 5 people that are on stage, and I happen to be the only woman. And this also is part of what Occupy Melbourne seeks to talk about. Why is it that we hear from men more than women? Why is it that we hear from privileged people more than less privileged people? And Occupy Melbourne, I believe, has worked very hard to try and get a whole range of voices heard. To the point where we've got one of our participants who uses a communication board where you point out the letters, he doesn't speak, and lots of people have worked really hard to learn a communication board for the first time because they actually care. They don't want to just patronisingly smile at the boy in the wheelchair and wish him well. They actually want to hear his voice and participate. For a while we had a homeless collective, and again this wasn't about patronising, this was about identifying a group whose voices often weren't heard. Great, now I've run away from my notes. So thinking about the General Assemblies, at one, people have queried about whether this direct democracy stuff can work. And I remember just after the eviction, I was asked to moderate a General Assembly. The proverbial had hit the fan, and I hadn't facilitated a General Assembly before, but I was asked to take on the role of moderator. So that's the person who kind of stands up the front and has a team of people that will work through the crowd and make sure all the voices are being heard. So I knew it would be controversial, but as I turned up on that day, I realised that there were going to be thousands of people there, and then there were several national TV cameras. And I knew that this moment could kind of spell the end of my activist career. The possibility of annoying most of the crowd was way up there. And it was a week before the Queen went, so the media were desperate for a story about how Occupy Melbourne were going to come and, you know, wreck the Queen's visit. And I'm still not quite sure how it happened. Certainly it was goodwill and a whole lot of belief in the process. But at the end of something like 3 hours, we had a whole lot of decisions that weren't made by one person or one group, but that we'd painstakingly worked through a whole lot of decisions together based on the sort of movement that we wanted. And that to me was one of the high points, because everybody wanted that system to break down in terms of the mass media, and we'll come back to kind of the role of the eviction. But there was so much stacked against us, but people believed in the process. People exercised their democratic right both to speak and to shut up that night, and somehow we got there. The second thing I think Occupy Melbourne has been very successful in is the creation of community, or maybe called the intensive resistance boot camp. Occupy Melbourne has given people a sense of belonging, but also been a place that people have been able to gather and share ideas and skills and passions. So from the practical things such as how to set up a communal kitchen or how to talk to corporate media and do media releases, through to what the difference is between an anarchist and a socialist, and in fact all the different flavours of socialist groups and how they operate, there's been a whole lot of deep learning. Just before Christmas, I was again facilitating a meeting, and we were talking about what we do over Christmas. And to me, this was one of the most powerful expressions of community, because amongst the decision-making process were a number of voices that said, there is no one I'd rather spend Christmas with. And to me, this speaks of the depth of kind of the bonds that have been built through Occupy Melbourne. This has sometimes been a bit of a tension, that the community imperatives and what people are looking to get out of in terms of the belonging stuff is often one of the deliberative factors in our political strategic decisions, such as what we do over Christmas. And this might be a strength or a weakness depending on your own perspective. So why is community important? Well, it's been a boot camp, so people are better equipped. People are better networked. And also, again, it has been a way to put into practice the politics. Thinking again about homeless people and the way that they've been given both a voice in the movement, but also thinking about how different groups of people have been politicised and active. So I turned up at an Occupy Melbourne event. There were a whole lot of homeless young people soliciting, not money for themselves, but signatures on a petition to support buskers in the city. And to me, this showed that actually Occupy Melbourne was starting to spring and build up new things. I'm not wanting to discount the messiness at Occupy Melbourne. There's been many challenges about how the internal workings have been. But I think this must be the case for any group that A, wants to truly listen to a whole lot of diverse voices that don't often get listened to, and work together in fairly radical participatory processes. So far I've talked about two things, and they've both been about what Occupy Melbourne has achieved inside the movement. We've been able to experiment and practice radical participatory processes that challenges the sort of top-down decision-making. And we've created a community that is passionate and much more ready to engage in resistance in the future. But I don't think Occupy Melbourne has just been effective in here. While we might not have had a revolution that's overthrown the whole of the community, I think that Occupy Melbourne has been deeply influential in our communities out there. The first thing, which Nick already alluded to, was I think we've changed the discourse. I don't know if anybody read the Wayne Swan's piece in the Monthly, our treasurer, but his article was couched in terms of the 99% and the 1%. And I think this is relevant because it takes the focus off poverty and the poor people who are marginalised and actually puts the focus on the top end of town and asks what they're doing that's problematic for our society. Not our dole bludgers, but our tax bludgers. Gina Reinhardt and her kind of creative family probably would have made it in the media anyway, but Occupy movements and Occupy Melbourne's given it a discourse. The second thing I think that Occupy Melbourne has achieved out there is that we have more resistance in Melbourne because of Occupy Melbourne, as well as experimenting with creative ways of resistance. And I think this has at least been an irritant to the 1%, and putting them on notice that business as usual will be harder. There's many regular protest activities that have met much swelled numbers because of Occupy Melbourne. It's also sought to be creative about the way that it does resistance. So the City of Melbourne had an intense crackdown about how tents were being used in public parks, and suddenly we had the birth of tent monsters and people that were running around public parks dodging the enforcement officers wearing tents. And I had a ball along with hundreds of others who dressed up in tents in the week before Christmas and danced our way down Burke Street, which was fantastic. Occupy Melbourne has also used what we have called mic checking to intervene in a variety of events. So mic checking has been adapted from Wall Street's human microphone, and it basically involves mic check, that I say something, and then people repeat it. And what this means is a group of people who might normally be silenced get their voices heard. So that's mic checking. A little bit cultish, but it actually does, in my view, create spaces for people. I was involved in a session where we mic checked a drone forum. So a publicly funded university, one of our key universities, not this one, was hosting a forum on civilian use of drone technology and talked about all the wonderful possibilities. It just happened that lots of the speakers at the forum also were involved in the US military or arms manufacturing companies. So many of us who've been following and resisting the war in Afghanistan were deeply concerned about this because we've watched the horror that drone technology has been with these unmanned aerial vehicles that are flying over Afghanistan as we speak and northern Pakistan and dropping bombs on kids. It's very hard to tell from a computer terminal in Texas who you're bombing in Afghanistan. So we went along and mic checked the forum, a bit like that, except I wasn't the speaker that was supposed to be mic checking. So what happened is people just stand up in the audience and had their say. And it's happened also in the City of Melbourne events. At this event at the university about drones, I was sitting at the front, and as we'd finished our mic check and sat down to take a breath, the military brass was saying, well, I guess this is free speech. And I leaned over and I said, no, this isn't free speech. This is about people wanting to rise up and interfere in the parts of our society that we find deeply repugnant. We don't want to sit down and just let things happen. And that takes me to the third thing that I think Occupy Melbourne has done, and I think it has actually provided the seeds of a threat to business as usual. And the main reason I say that is because as you viewed the footage of the eviction of Occupy Melbourne in City Square, by many accounts was the most brutal police behaviour towards protesters that people have ever seen. And this is relevant because, as lots of non-violent theorists tell us, people can protest all they like. We can write letters and we can have our street marches and we can do all sorts of things that ask for the status quo to be changed. It is only when people start to step forward and demand the status quo be changed that that's where you see the state freak out. And that's what we had. Somewhere between Ted Baillieu and his new law and order squad and the City of Melbourne Lord Mayor, who's known to be connected with big business, somewhere the authorities freaked out. They saw Occupy Melbourne and didn't think that they could let it go on because of what might happen. And to me, this shows that Occupy Melbourne has shown something that actually threatens that which is unjust in our society, that people aren't going to stand for anymore. So as I try and find the last of my notes. So in conclusion, I believe that Occupy Melbourne has been very effective. We have brought together a highly diverse group of people and experimented with both participatory processes and built a radical community. And our creative tactics have impacted not only the discourse around us, but they put the power and wealth of oppressive forces on notice. And I think that's worth diving into the ocean experiment.